So hello and welcome to this week's training. My name again is Annaleah Hilker. I am the Upkid Teacher Manager. Today's training, we are going to go over a couple of the other ways that children can be abused. The two ways that I'll talk about, they're very similar in how they appear and the signs that kids show if they are being abused this way. So those are mental and psychological, and then emotional or verbal abuse. So this talking about abuse specifically when it comes to children is kind of a hard topic. It's not fun to talk about. It's not fun to recognize the ugly truth that is actually out there. So I want to hear from you guys, like, because this is such a hard topic, why is it important that we discuss it, and why is it important that we recognize the signs that someone is being abused?
I mean, for one, oh, sorry, was someone else trying to talk to, or is that me?
You're good.
Okay, sorry. I was just gonna say Utah is a mandatory reporting state. So, and not only just for like childcare providers and teachers, but any adult is, required to report any type of abuse, as well too is just because we are, and especially because we work with children up so close, we are uniquely capable and like able of seeing those patterns that maybe just someone just a neighbor or anything, even more so. So I think we have a lot more responsibility just because of our proximity to children. So, yeah.
Yeah, I definitely agree. We are in a very unique position where we get to kind of look out for these kids more so than some other people might. Kasia also said, so we can be able to help any and all kids if needed. And I agree. I think that those are both really good reasons as to why we discuss it. One, we are mandatory reporters. So if we see or suspect something, we do need to report that. But if we don't know what we're supposed to be looking out for, it's kind of hard to report it as well. And then Maddie said, it's important because sometimes people who are being abused don't know that they are being abused. It's also important because even if they know they're being abused, they might not want to admit it. And when it comes to kids, sometimes their family and home life isn't safe and can't protect them from the abuse. That is a great point that I will actually talk a little bit about later on, about how these kids might not recognize that they're being abused, but also why they wouldn't report it themselves. So again, we're in that unique position where we get to report even if these kids can't do it for themselves. So while it is a hard subject, it is one that we will continue to talk about. So again, kids might not understand what is happening, or they're afraid of what will happen if they do talk about it. So going right back into that last comment, children, especially if they're really young, they might not recognize that what is happening to them is abuse, whether it's sexual abuse, physical abuse, this emotional, psychological, verbal, and also neglect. They don't necessarily recognize what it is. They just think that it's normal for them to be living that way. Or on the other hand, if they're a little bit older and they do recognize that what's happening to them is wrong, they're scared that if they talk about it, all the bad things that are happening at home are just going to get worse. So being able to recognize the signs that children will show when they are being abused will help us to be able to not rely on word of mouth from the kids. It will help us to be able to actually be the protectors that these kids need when they are in these really unfortunate situations. Another important reason to talk about it is Abuse can cause damages both mentally and physically, that if we are able to recognize them and report them and get those children out of those abusive situations earlier, it can prevent and lessen those damages. So again, just recognizing them, being able to talk about it. While it's hard, we are able to really make life easier for these kids when they're in these not so good situations. So going over what mental abuse is. Mental abuse is meant to undermine your self-esteem and make you feel worse about yourself. This is also a form of manipulation and control, and the effects of mental abuse are just as detrimental as the effects of physical abuse. You'll hear a lot that sexual or physical abuse, they're the worst abuses out there. It's the worst thing that could happen to a person. And while they are definitely bad, mental and verbal abuse are just as detrimental as that physical and sexual abuse. So then going into what verbal abuse is. Verbal abuse typically involves some sort of verbal interaction that causes a person emotional harm, often prompting them to question who they are. It is a way for a person to control and manipulate power over another person. So both mental and verbal abuse, they look and sound very, very similar. It's why the signs and damages are the same as well. It's because what counts as mental abuse and what counts as verbal abuse, there's only a slight difference between the two. Typically, verbal abuse is somebody who will specifically tell you that you're not a good person, whereas mental abuse will kind of suggest it and leave it up to you and your brain to make those connections. But because they suggest it so often, the only thing that your brain is left to do is actually make that connection of, well, if you're suggesting that I'm a bad person, then I must actually be a bad person. So again, just kind of reiterating, verbal is words that bring the other person down, whereas mental is words that make the other person question what they're doing, who they are. So an example of that would be verbal abuse is somebody would tell you in plain words that you're worthless, or you are not helping, you're making the situation worse, you aren't good for people. Any of those types of things would be verbal, versus if a person was to look at you and say something like, well, if you do that, then I guess you really don't matter. Or if this is the way you feel, then I guess I'm wrong. Or anything like that just hints at, well, you could be right, but because of how I'm phrasing it, you're actually wrong. So it's just this mental game that they play with you, and it's very manipulative. Verbal abuse is also manipulative, but that mental abuse, it's this nasty game where you as a person tend to think worse about yourself. It lowers your self-esteem. Whereas verbal abuse feels a lot more like the physical attacks just to you and who you are as a person. Any questions about any of this before we go on to what some of the signs look like? Perfect. Okay. So some of the signs of abuse, again, going to that decreased self-esteem. It is really hard for people that are being attacked verbally and mentally to feel like they are worth anything as a person. So this sign of abuse can often present itself in negative self-talk. These kids will tell themselves, after they've done something wrong, that they are bad, that they aren't worth it. And if it's done so out loud, that can be a very big sign that this child is experiencing mental or emotional abuse at home. As we talk about these signs, I also want to point out before we get too far into them, when we talked about neglect 2 weeks ago, neglect, I mentioned that it's a consistent thing. If you see those signs consistently, that is typically when you need to be concerned about neglect actually happening. With emotional and verbal abuse, mental and verbal abuse, they're not necessarily consistent signs, but they're signs paired with other signs. So a child just expressing low self-esteem might not necessarily indicate that verbal or mental abuse, but if they had that low self-esteem mixed with some of these other signs, that is typically when we need to be concerned. And that is when we would want to be able to report that we suspect abuse at home. So again, that decreased self-esteem is a pretty big sign. Delays in development. So this can be both mental and physical. So if they are struggling with learning how to walk, they could be experiencing mental or verbal abuse. If they are having a hard time learning their ABCs or recognizing their colors, having a harder time understanding games, different things like that. These are all delays in development that could be signs of abuse. And this ties into this one down here. Typically, the delays is because these children are afraid that if they do something wrong, that they're going to get in trouble. So they would rather not try something than to try and fail. This also leads into this next one, which is difficulty expressing themselves. So they'll either always tell you that they're fine, they'll never express emotions, or they will overly express emotions. So they get angry a lot easier, and then it'll switch to being overly joyful the next minute. They have a hard time trusting that if they express themselves properly, that you won't tell them that they're doing something wrong for that expression. Another sign of this mental or verbal abuse can be sleeping or eating disorders. Your sleeping disorder typically shows up in your younger kids, whereas your eating disorders typically show up in your older toddlers to like your preschool and elementary school age. But if you all of a sudden start to notice that these children's eating or sleeping habits are changing, that can be a sign of abuse. Again, this is probably the one that I would say is the biggest one of mental or verbal abuse. They're terrified of doing something, anything, and everything wrong. And that's because that's what they're being told. They're being told that they're not worth it. They're being told that no matter what they do or how they do it, it's bad or incorrect. So even if they do something perfect, they're being nitpicked at home for all of these little things. So they live in this constant fear that they're going to do something wrong. And then if they do something wrong, that they're going to get in trouble. So that one, I think, again, I say it's the biggest one because it ties into a lot of the behind the scenes of all of these other signs of abuse. Another sign is if a child is lying, stealing, anything that would show a lack of trust in adults. The hard thing with mental and verbal abuse is kids don't just associate the one person that is mentally and verbally abusing them with that abuse. They tend to think that all adults feel that way towards them. So their lack of trust is towards all adults, not just those that are actually expressing that abuse. So this is why it's one of the harder ones for a kid to actually tell you about too, is because they don't trust that you're not going to do the exact same thing if they do tell you about it. And the last sign that we'll talk about, these kids will typically develop unhealthy coping mechanisms, strategies, or habits, such as a continuation of sucking their thumb longer than is typically seen in children. They'll bite the sides or their fingernails. They'll develop this habit of rocking to cope with emotion instead of expressing that emotion. And then in some of your older kids, you can see them start to self-harm, whether that's through that eating disorder, sleeping disorders. Those are both ways of self-harm, as well as physical harm to themselves. So again, abuse, it's a hard one to talk about, but it is really important that we do, because these kids, the safe place that they're supposedly getting nurtured and cared and loved for isn't always that safe place for them. And because we are these caregivers, we are with these children on a more personal level than other adults, we get to see the habits, and we get to see the signs as they appear, which again puts us in that very unique position where we do have to make that hard call of reporting, or again, I recommend talking to the daycare provider, simply because they know these kids better than we do. But we are put in this position where we get to love these kids, and sometimes loving them means that we have to report signs of abuse, which is not fun, and it is very difficult. With that being said, that is the end of what I have prepared. Does anybody have any questions or comments that they would like to share?
I don't know if you addressed this and I skipped it, but sometimes kids also don't show any reactions. They usually are like shut down or withdrawn or isolate themselves, and like that's also a sign of even sexual abuse, because again, like they can't trust anybody.
Yeah, I didn't necessarily go over that one today because we weren't talking about sexual abuse specifically, but that is, it goes into this difficulty of expressing themselves. This can be both with adults and with other kids. They might have a hard time making friends because they don't want their friends to see them fail, or they're scared that they'll fail at making a friend. So they can be, again, not very reclusive, just stick to themselves. You're right, that is another sign of abuse as well. Other comments or questions about this training? Perfect.